So we recently had accepted and published a scientific paper in the journal called Protocols and Methods. This is published by MDPI. It's an open access journal, which means that we pay a pretty hefty fee in order to have anybody freely access
Yes.
this journal anywhere. And the subject matter of the paper dealt with measuring cetylpyridinium chloride and being able to relate that to the availability of that and its potency against microbes in a glycolytic model that we have. Anyway, there's a link. If you're watching this, there'll be a link to that paper. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to talk about this because I saw a report a couple months ago, and it was about scientists, chemists in particular, that were publishing. And there was some kind of new information that came out because it was a way to quantify this kind of topic. I'm being a little bit cheeky about it here, secretive. We're going to be talking about it here. But because we recently have published this paper,
Yes.
everything is really new. And some of the other episodes, we talked about that. I'm often a reviewer for some of these scientific publications. And this is just something that I think I've been wanting to talk about it. And I think it's appropriate, especially because there should be some more scrutiny on, just because you have a paper published doesn't mean that that's it. And say, hey, look, I had the paper published and it was published by so and so or from where it was published. That means that everything is good and everything is right. And we should believe absolutely everything that we hear about this, including, for instance, studies about nanohydroxyapatite or other technologies or other things. And so, again, not trying to knock this, trying to keep an open mind. And the recent paper that I just had read about that we'll be talking about here in just a minute, it brings to light important issues involving ethics.
Interesting. So,
Yes.
welcome to Daniel Formulator's Playbook. This is Dr. Rob, and I usually accompany him. My name's Tami. So, yes, indeed, we are very excited about the publication. There was lots of quality work and effort. And unfortunately, I know you spent a great deal of New Year's Day going back and forth with the reviewers and responding to their comments and whatnot. But what were you going to share regarding not our publication, but what was so eye-opening?
So there was a paper that was published in October 25, and it was in the journal called Accountability in Research. And they surveyed 982 chemists, those that willingly, provided some feedback on, whether something had to happen with respect to their papers. Anyway, the outcome, and I'll tell you in just a minute, I know I'm being secretive about it. The results of that paper were picked up by other various sources, like other partners, including the American Chemical Society, of which I'm a member. And then they have a weekly periodical that they send to all their members. So this is why I get it. Chemical and Engineering News. And so they did a highlight on this too. So not only was this paper published on October 25, then the American Chemical Society kind of followed up on it. And that's how I became aware of it. And this is why we're talking about it.
Okay, so I'm going to speak juicy information.
Yeah, yeah, juicy, salacious.
And chemical and engineering news.
Yeah.
So, what was it?
Well, so they discovered that of all those panelists, it was over almost 1,982 participants, about 1 in 5, or essentially then 20%, knowingly falsify information on their papers to get them accepted.
Okay, so
to me, that's about as salacious and as juicy as it can get. Because
so I wasn't expecting you to say that.
No.
Because people make mistakes all the time.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, these aren't just editorial errors. This isn't just mislabeling one group for another group. Sometimes it happens. I've even had that happen to me where, you accidentally refer to stuff. No, this is actual either, you are fudging the data, you're taking out, like, for instance, you'll have experimental data that'll have a bunch of different points. Sometimes that data is replaced by the smooth line fits.
And
there have been proven instances. Yeah, or they'll make comments and say, oh, yeah, well, we did this method, or we used this gas, or we used this particular procedure in order to do this, just to be able to comply with, for instance, reviewer comments, just to be able to overcome some scrutiny that might otherwise exist instead of battling it out. And sometimes you have to battle it out. I've been a part of these things with how many, papers that I've published. I don't publish a ton anymore just by nature of our model. A lot of our stuff is secret. A lot of the stuff is, either trade secrets, or we're working on, formulations for others, or for our own purposes.
People just need to come to us if they want
know?
certain things done.
Exactly. So if anybody wants to get an idea on some of what I've published, because I published in a lot of different spaces, go to my Google Scholar, site. Just put in Robert L. Carlinzi and just look at that, and there will be over 80 different entries that pop up, and they're going to be in seemingly random fields, including like optics or ice nucleation or platinum catalysts and things like this. Like there's all different kinds of things. It's not just preventive dentistry. It's not just formulations.
Right.
So I've been exposed to a different, a broad set of fields. So, I'm pretty aware of things.
You've been in science for quite some time.
Quite some time. We just don't do a lot of publishing. But whenever I saw this was eye-opening. This was eye-opening. Do you want to know more about it?
Yeah, it's frustrating though.
Well,
yeah. So here's the most alarming thing for me, knowing human behavior in general. If 20% actually admitted it, how many more are actually doing it but not admitting it?
Yeah, I mean, that is probably one of the major take homes here because, we're all human. We don't want to be, we don't want to necessarily call ourselves out. We're all, everybody has their closets full of whatever skeletons it is, right? We don't want that to be made known publicly usually, and we really don't like admitting whenever we're wrong. There's, especially as a scientist, it's really, really hard. This is it's an especial egotistical area. And there's a high amount of risk. What are my fellow colleagues going to think? Is funding related? Is my sponsor? Or
sometimes.
Exactly. And one thing can just, all it takes is one thing, right? To bring down essentially, if it is built on a house of cards, and sometimes it is, then that's what happens. It could take you for, a lifetime building up a career, and only one thing can be made to destroy that. We all know that. I mean, there's obviously, examples of that in everyday life, even if it's among celebrities or whoever it is, but, it also applies to science and the different, fields,
right.
Companies, things like this. I mean, it's just what it is.
So tell me more about what they found.
Well, it's just really interesting that most of these authors and researchers who did admit to having some falsified data, some false data, and whenever I say falsification, it could be inaccurate, inaccuracies, it could be fudged procedures. Again, it's not just the actual data that's being presented. It could be the methods. It could be, what they wrote about.
And doesn't have to be huge. It could just be little.
Be huge, but it probably affected the quality and the outcome of the paper. So most chose not to formally correct the scholarly record, meaning they did not try to publish any kind of retraction or like volunteer retraction. They did not try to submit a correction to the journal. They just kind of just let it there and hoped that nobody would notice.
So basically, they knowingly falsified it and then just kind of went stum and kept their mouth shut and crossed their fingers and hoped nobody found out.
Hope nobody found out. Now, those that did, now it gets more interesting in that. So we know that it's about 20%. I believe that number is probably large. Okay. It's probably higher than that.
Yeah.
It's not to say that I don't think that scientists are truthful and honest. I just think that everybody's a human until the AI starts writing all these papers, and the AI input's going to be based on whatever is fed into the
humans and human error.
Human error, humans in general are going to be flawed. You can't be 100% correct all the time.
And that's acceptable.
And that's acceptable.
That part.
But if you're trying to actually do things that are going to be a little bit, I don't know, eyebrow raising, well, this is it. So anyway, so of that 20%, okay, so then we're going to talk about some of the different methods that those that did want to address it, not by writing a correction or asking for a retraction, they did it in other ways. And there were multiple selections on what they were, asked to say, hey, what have you done? Or what did you do this? And so all these percents, if somebody's trying to, add up the percents, it's going to be more than 100% because I'm using all these other different percents. It's just the nature of the work that they
Okay, so this sounds like their justifications of how they handled it.
So here, how they handled it. So again, most not, we're going to state it again. Most chose not to formally correct this. Okay. So 42% decided that they would just talk about these errors in private, whether it was at a coffee break or at a conference. Done.
Okay, really?
We talk about it. It's done. Over with. Boom.
So the publication went out to a whole bunch of people, but in privately, I'm going to tell a couple people, okay, so maybe it was a little different.
That's right. Another 33% said, well, you know what? There are problems in this paper, but you know how we're going to address it? In our next paper, in some kind of random future paper, we will address the problems in that other paper.
If they publish again, or if they do get accepted for another paper.
Yes.
They don't Do another paper.
Well, that's the whole point, right? And then another 30% decided that the best way to correct their errors in this paper, 30%, they said, well, we'll just talk to students during training courses.
So let me tell students that I totally screwed up
Oh
and didn't fix it.
so yeah, so it's crazy. So those were the most popular.
Okay.
Okay, so most did not choose to correct it. Those that did want to correct it, those were the three popular ways. So no wonder that there's going to be other avenues and there's going to be extra scrutiny. We're going to bring up several case studies here in this podcast that talk about it, and they are very recent. Some are a little distant, maybe 20 years ago, but others are super recent, and they are very important examples. And this is highly relevant to just everything, to how research, how formulation, to just how you should approach life and be aware of that if you're dabbling in the science. So
You're not necessarily talking about just in the oral care field.
no,
You're talking about
just
science in general.
science in general.
Science.
Yeah, because like I think we said this at the beginning, right? You don't go to there's no program that says, "Hey, how do I become a formulator in oral care space?" There is zero programs that offer that, right? You might have a course, maybe, but there's nothing about that. There's also no other formal undergrad course to know about preventive dentistry, to have all of your, information about, strengthening measurements, any kind of microscopy, microbiology, fluoride,
So much involved.
genetics and stuff. Usually that's not until you get to, graduate school, maybe dental school, but then you have maybe a course, maybe two, and come on, that's just for theory. You got to get to being in the clinic,
Right.
working on the actual teeth. I mean, that's where really the skill set's learned. So anyway, so you can see how if there are these three ways, so discussions are being made about this paper or this whatever has these flaws, whether it's the students, whether it's somebody else may made, you can understand then that 28% then reported talking to or emailing the author. So somewhere along those lines, some of the other scientists who became aware that somebody was doing dirty somewhere, they decided that, you know what, we're going to take it upon ourselves and we're going to correct it. We're going to reach out to the journal and see if, just let them know, hey, there might be some questionable stuff here. And, again, that could be the reviewers, that could be the fellow co-authors, it could be the students or any colleagues that became aware of this.
That might not turn out so well.
Yeah, and most of them, if they were then, approached,
Yeah.
by the journal, they just decided to ignore it and say, hey, you know what? We're not gonna even cite the paper. We're just gonna ignore it and make it, act like it never happened.
In some ways, I'm not surprised because one, science is, first of all, it's difficult. I'm not gonna lie, it's difficult. It's challenging.
Difficult.
Like you said, it can make and break careers and whatnot. There's definitely a certain amount of ego that goes with it, and wow, and admitting to those errors would be a blow to the self-esteem.
Yeah,
I can see it.
absolutely,
I can. Doesn't mean I agree with it.
So for those that, became aware then, that raised the point to the journal, and then the journal contacted the author or whatever be the case, some of them then got very frustrated, right? But you can obviously see that these percents are going to continue to diminish and they're going to be very singularly. Why? Because we all have our own jobs and our own lives and all of our own craziness and madness going on. We don't have the time normally to try to make a concerted effort against something else to attract and just make it a big deal. Usually, if this is going to be brought about, you can imagine it's probably going to be somebody who's retired or somebody who has time on their hands or somebody who is just so willing to go down that road because it's such a grievous, event that they have to rectify, right? That they will die on that hill no matter what, but that's not going to be the majority of people. So that's why some of these other smaller percents were then used. So
unfortunately,
all of these,
a lot of scientists who are willing on New Year's Day to go back and forth and do the right thing by making corrections and citing your argument.
Well,
right?
sure, so all of these responses then for those who knew that there was something wrong with the paper, this is what they decided to do. And again, everything was less than 10%. Okay. Some of them decided to either write a formal letter, comment, or note to the journal. Others started to say, hey, you know what? We tried, but why don't we try to replicate what they did, in a complete different style.
Okay.
These are replication products or projects. Some of them even decided to just formally publish a refutation to that journal. And, because that can also happen. You can, submit a commentary and you can either support or.
So calling people out is what it sounds like.
Or just, offering, say, it just doesn't make sense and this is why, or they can decide to take things in an open access kind of forum where you just have a discussion. It doesn't really go to the journal, but it all of a sudden becomes pretty known in an online community. So
Okay.
one of those communities is called Pub Peer. So that's sometimes where these discussions can be had about
Ooh,
certain
I
papers,
would not
right?
want to be called out on that. So based on our discussions, I mean, this could be seriously a significant problem. Falsifying data, right? It's
Yeah,
not good.
and they do this, because it's a hard thing to get a paper published. Sometimes it isn't, but you really want to get that paper published. And this is again why they're doing this. What is the streamlined action that I can take to help, pacify the reviewers, the editor, right? Or editors as it may be, and how can I get this thing going? Your results might be true. They very well might be in some of these things. But if you tweak other things in the paper, that's important too. Whether it's how you made the material, for instance, or how you measured the material's
Mhm.
properties, let alone did you take out the actual raw data and replace it with the fitted line data, which is usually much smoother and prettier to look at. These are things
Right.
that are commonly done to try to allay concerns, to try to easily address criticisms because it's tough. I mean, as somebody who has wrote a lot of papers, and whenever I say I wrote, personally, a lot of times you'll see professors that might have, especially at university, they'll have 400 papers. Are they really the ones writing all those 400 papers?
No.
It's impossible, right? Sometimes it's a graduate student, sometimes they have,
Right.
postdocs, sometimes they have dedicated people that are helping them do this.
Yeah, the higher ups get the glory.
Higher ups getting, and that is usually the case. I mean, that's just the nature of the
Right.
beast. But those also higher ups generally are not as well known then, and they don't know how to successfully counter well thought out
Okay.
arguments. I have found that whenever I see conferences and stuff and somebody challenges and it's like, well, this is what it is, or they completely talk around the subject because they don't understand and they don't know enough about the
Right.
topic because
Okay.
you can't do everything. You can't be everything and do all these things.
Right.
But that's a whole nother story. So,
Okay. So
you
I'm
know,
gonna guess this isn't new
no,
information.
no, no. I've had some really interesting, I guess exposures, if you will, to just certain environments with this. One of them was whenever I was in my second year, I believe, grad school at Indiana University. Go football team, by the way. So in Bloomington, right? I was in the chemistry and physics departments, and I was taking a lot of physics courses just because of the nature of the degree, right? That I was going for, chemical physics. All of a sudden, and I was taking a lot of physics-based stuff that had to deal with electricity, conductivity. In fact, when I had a project to
Mhm.
try to, create a device to measure conductivity. Well, there was a topic that came up, superconductivity. So superconductivity, for those that don't know, that's whenever you absolutely have zero resistance in whatever material that's displaying
Okay.
any kind of conduction. So think of copper wire, right? That you're going to have excellent conductivity for
Okay.
that electron transport. It'll have minimal resistance, but it still has resistance. Superconductors are not necessarily just metals, they're usually ceramics or some other kind of combination. They always have resistance. And so what you want to do is get that resistance down to zero.
Okay.
That usually requires using very expensive freezing liquids like liquid nitrogen and liquid helium
Okay.
in order to do that because you lower the temperature, you reduce the resistance, and you greatly increase then the electricity. There's less loss.
Okay.
We'll talk about that in just a little bit,
Makes
but
sense.
but this was a huge deal because there was a lot of activity in this, and there has been for a long time. Superconductivity is like a holy grail of like conduction and like electronics anyway. So if anybody finds a first room temperature, in other words, something that doesn't require freezing liquids to be able to display superconductivity behavior, I mean that's a Nobel Prize, and I mean you might as well,
The world
yeah,
changes,
the
right?
world just changes, incredibly. Anyway, so whenever I was a graduate student, I was taking courses. All of a sudden, it became aware that there were scientists, as we were learning and studying in the courses, there were scientists at Bell Labs that were just remarkably productive. And they published a total of 9 papers in just 2 journals, the journal heavyweights, Science and Nature, 8 of them in Science and 1 of them in Nature.
Wow.
And all of these papers came from a laboratory called Bell Labs, and one of the lead authors and the lead, organizers was a scientist by the name of J.H. Schern. Okay,
Okay.
which that's a name that it's going to be ironic here. It has the name means beautiful or nice in German, but
I always learn so much from you.
but the Bell Labs is where a lot of these a lot of these innovations and improvements in conduction with application to superconductivity were coming out.
I've heard you talk about Bell Labs before. That's a
Yes.
really well-known research facility,
Absolutely.
correct?
Yeah.
And it's one that actual Nobel prize winners have come from there,
Oh yeah,
correct?
absolutely. Yeah, you're talking about, especially like the developments with
Yikes.
the transistor. I mean, electronics. There's so many different things. Bell Labs is so important to innovation. It would be as important to just science and innovation as like a university like MIT would be, right?
Okay, well,
Okay,
that
so it
helps.
has that kind of gravity. Scientists will come from Bell Labs sometimes if they want to go into academia, and they would probably have a very good chance of getting some academic position, no matter what, as long as they were productive and successful at Bell Labs. It's a very good place. How was it founded? Well, with proceeds from the telephone, and it was founded then by the Atlantic Telephone and Telegraph Company.
Otherwise known as AT&T, right?
Yep, that's right. Back in the early 20th century, right, where the Bell was, responsible for helping to usher in the
Right.
telephone and then the rights and licensing and all that other stuff. Anyway, the whole point is those were seminal papers that remarked on observations on how superconductivity might be achieved, or just advances. I don't want to go too much into there.
Hitting
Yeah, these were heavy hitting,
journals.
no doubt. But there was a problem.
Okay, so I'm guessing there's discrepancies, right?
Yeah, replication ultimately became a problem. And once that created doubt, and it was just a small crack in that foundation,
Uh-oh.
suddenly some of the co authors started looking at the data that was being presented. They're like, what's going on? And then other research groups outside of Bell Labs were, because it's,
So even
again,
within their own
even
team.
within their own team, and they're like, oh my God, something is going on. The data was either smooth. Again, this is a classic example of maybe some data was replaced. Some of the data
Okay.
scatter was replaced with nice, smooth fitting lines to make it look good. So, it was.
So this is along with what you brought up then, up to 20% admitted, right, to falsifying data.
Yeah,
That's where we're going.
absolutely. So every single one of those papers, and if you're watching this on YouTube or whatever, there's links here that you can see to like the retractions. All 8 of those science journals were retracted, and that one in Nature was also retracted. But scientists are lucky to even get one Nature or Science article in their lifetime. Could
Wow.
you imagine? And 9, like in a short span, like they just kept on
Too good to be
pumping it out. It was
true.
almost too good to be true. Yeah. So, but somebody may say, well, that was maybe over 20 years ago. Have things changed? No, they haven't changed. So, even more recently, superconductivity again made headlines. I mean, and if anybody wants to read about it, I mean, there's all kind of articles about this. Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, all of
Definitely a
this.
hot topic.
A University of Rochester scientist and his team published 2 papers in Nature in 2020 and 2023 that also claimed evidence of superconductivity, but this time it was going to be at room temperature with a special material that was made under exceptional, pressure conditions.
Okay, so you earlier, if I remember correctly, said that would be the Holy Grail.
That
So
would be
that
the
means
holy grail. Yes, and absolutely. And so, this obviously is going to catch attention because all of a sudden, all you got to do is apply an incredible amount of pressure on a material and it exudes superconductivity. Oh, by the way, at or near room temperature, sign me up,
wow.
yeah. So that caught a lot of attention. And just as a reminder, maglev trains that are popular, for instance, in Japan,
Yeah.
they operate on the principles of superconductivity, right?
Okay.
So the magnets would require extensive cooling in order to be able to get those trains to be levitated in
Okay.
order for them to be moved. So that's the real world application right here, just like something that maybe some people might be familiar with.
Makes sense.
A lot of people have heard of the term maglev, magnetic levitation. The magnet is able to do so whenever it's, cooled
Mm-hmm.
down, a lot less loss. They call it a lot less resistance.
Okay.
So you're getting more bang for your buck there. But yeah, I mean, this is a big deal.
Okay. So ultimately, I mean, you said some of the co-authors were looking at what ultimately, oh, that was previously. So on
Yeah.
this one, what led to,
Well, it's pretty interesting because we talked about it earlier. You got to have time on your hands, right? So there was a retired professor at the University of Geneva that caught wind of this. I don't know. I didn't look too much into the story. I don't know if he was one of the reviewers. He might not have been, but I think he saw the data because he's interested. He's a physicist, interested in
right.
superconductivity. He knew this and he was looking at the data. He goes, I just don't think something's right
Yeah.
here.
It's supposed to be the Holy Grail.
Yeah, so he's the one that really acted as a catalyst. And then other
Okay.
scientists started questioning some stuff and they said, okay, well, let's see if we can look at the paper. Maybe we can try to replicate some of what this scientist at University of Rochester is doing. And let's see if we can repeat this maybe.
Okay. So did anyone then, so basically they were trying to see if they could do
Yeah,
it, do
absolutely.
exactly what was outlined in the
Yeah,
paper,
two
right?
different sites, one in Shanghai, one at the University of Nanjing. They both tried to recreate that same material, and they did. And they were able to get it to be superconducting at the pressures needed once they created that material. And just like that, just like those two original papers in Nature, however, it wasn't at room temperature. They did not have any evidence for it.
Okay.
So two different, sites. They could not replicate that.
Right.
I think that's important, right?
Right. And so it's interesting that you bring this up because this is really little discussed outside the science world, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it's
right.
not typical Starbucks conversation, as you're waiting for
No,
your coffee or anything.
no.
You hear about sports teams, Kardashians, whatever. And
Yep.
but you usually don't hear this kind of really important stuff just in more casual conversations, but it has big implications.
Yeah, it does. One way that this is sometimes addressed, and I hope that it's becoming more of a topic, more than 20 years ago, we're talking 30 years ago plus probably now. There was a research experience for undergraduate program that I applied for and I got accepted. Some of these different colleges have these. I was accepted at the one at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell.
Okay.
And this program was like a 6 to 8 week program. You get to, as an undergraduate, you get exposure into research, you get on these different teams,
Hmm.
and you get to, discover more about what being a scientist is
Yeah.
like, maybe you get to learn some skills, get to network a little bit, and you get exposed to different courses. Well, one of the courses that I was exposed to was scientific ethics.
Ooh, that's
And
interesting.
it was a relatively newer thing, and it was only for the course of 6 weeks. Now, my fellow RAU students didn't really care for that too much, but I was really interested in it. And as a graduate student at IU, and this is no shade on IU, but there are no ethics that you take,
Really?
for your science. There weren't. Well, let's put it this way:
That time.
there wasn't then, and I would highly doubt that there is now. Now, in undergrad, I took a lot of philosophy and I took a lot of ethics. So this is one of the reasons why this appealed to me. And I took business ethics, I took just standard ethics, I took computer ethics, and I took a host of different philosophies. I almost minored in philosophy. I had so many courses, I think I was like one
Okay.
course away. But, getting exposed to this really was important, and
Hmm.
especially for somebody who tries to do the right thing.
Yeah.
That in the course of this, I really do try to
Yes.
do the right thing
I can
because
I can see where the other people are like, really, why, but you definitely tend to think differently than this, and you really always strive to do the right thing.
yeah, I mean, and this is one of the reasons why
Yeah.
I harp maybe sometimes on, hey, make sure you're testing in a right model. There's
Right.
models for this. Can it be reproduced independently? Where are your reviews coming from? Are they completely unbiased, or is this just, being regurgitated?
At least the
You
listeners know
know?
where this is
Yeah,
coming
they know
from.
where this is coming
You
from.
want the right thing to be
I
done.
want the right thing to be done.
Okay.
Sometimes it's hard, sometimes mistakes are made, but ultimately we want the right thing to be done. But since you brought up AI in addition to all the other Starbucks stuff, I have another example, another case.
Oh, so is there an interesting
Yes,
story?
so there's
Okay.
and this will be the last story, okay? But maybe some of the listeners have heard of this, maybe they haven't, but recently there was an economics graduate student at MIT who had created a model, an AI-based model based on data, and he was using that as a thesis and as another tool, if you will, to get, not only his degree if he was going to continue to get his
Right.
doctorate degree, but then of course for startup companies and investments and all these other
Of
things.
course.
Okay.
So MIT is
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah, huge, right?
Economics is not necessary. I mean, it's huge because it's worldwide, but
Right.
whatever. But MIT, wow. I
Yeah.
want to know more.
Yeah, this is going to be interesting, and I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole here because it's just too much, right? But just it's important for the listeners to know this extends beyond hard science. It's not just about superconductivity, retracting
That's a
papers and
great
stuff.
point.
Even in the course of research, especially those that have access to data from companies, all of a sudden it starts, and this is just what we know about, right? The stuff in companies, you think they're going to publish that kind of stuff? There's a reason why sometimes the data there's not as much data necessarily published from
Wow.
companies
Mm.
as there is academia. This is one reason why you'll see more abstracts and more presentations at conferences, but then some of
Okay.
those conference papers won't necessarily turn into a full paper and get published in journals. There's several reasons for that. it's not, it doesn't have anything to do with ethics really, but it has to do with, keeping company secrets and everything else.
Well, that makes sense.
But at the same time, you would also then think, well, geez, there might be some stuff going on, right? Inside a company. And people already know that, like whistleblowing, right? We
Right.
already know that,
So what happened at
and everything
MIT?
else. Okay, so MIT. So here's a student, and I think he's no longer at MIT. I think he withdrew, but he did submit a paper for publication,
Okay.
and he put it on a preprint server, and it's still there. Only the author can actually retract it. MIT is trying to get that paper retracted. They're trying to really put the fort because he's no longer there, and he doesn't care. He's not responding to
And
getting that paper
MIT doesn't want to be
retracted. And
associated with
MIT
it.
doesn't want to be, they don't want to be associated. In fact, they have their whole, oh, okay, after, I just briefly tell the synopsis, I would, I'll say that MIT actually has their own, comment about this whole thing that they made as in terms of, within the economics department, their
Wow.
ethics involved in this, and saying they did not know, they do not condone, and we do not support any of this. So what happened was this researcher
Okay.
apparently created a fraudulent agreement between MIT and some company. Some people originally thought that maybe that company might be Corning, who makes a lot of the glass, or 3, who, makes everything, right?
Right.
But those companies have said that they've never interacted and they've never shared data in any way with anybody like this. So who the company was that was part of this fraudulent agreement, maybe it was a made up company in addition to the fraudulent, agreement.
Likely.
But apparently there was data that was coming from almost over 1,000 scientists that they've looked at, data from them. So he put the data from this company, whatever company that is, that had over 1,000 scientists, and he said that they were able to use his tool, his AI tool, to then create new intellectual property based on all the data that was provided to him. And that created new intellectual property that led to new materials
Oh
and
my
increased
gosh.
productivity. But then, of course, he also said, but there was a negativity. There only one negative reaction here. It was that the workers didn't feel like, they weren't happy using the model. They didn't like using it much.
Okay, wait
That
a
was that
minute.
was the only drawback.
Okay, so there's no way that's
So
supported or anything,
right.
right?
So yeah. So after this came out, so when he was presenting on this, he would do this at seminars. He would talk to his advisors and stuff. Investors were starting to become interested.
Wow.
Of course, you have public relations is now starting to get involved. So all of a
Mhm.
sudden, you have journalists now writing about this. And again, if you're watching this, there's some links that
Wow.
I'm sharing
Yeah.
here. But who was the company? Which company was it? What kind of data? Where the agreement? All this, there was way too many question marks. Nothing seemed to add up. Nothing, even the conclusions that were being made. Like, why wouldn't you like to use the AI model
Right.
if you were doing well?
Right.
If it was making these more productive, it was a little strange. So who
Okay,
knows?
so obviously it's a high interest fields like superconductivity
Yep.
and AI is the big hot one right now. Will
Yep.
generate significantly more interest and scrutiny than maybe a fluoride-free
Oh my
toothpaste.
God. Yeah, we're at the bottom here. Yeah.
Oh, I don't want to say that. I don't agree. Yet, so there's still issues. But the point is, issues remain across the board. Can we trust the quality of work when we see it? When perhaps 20% of what's published could be
Yeah,
falsified.
I mean, I think that that's the main point here, right? That's the take home. So when final products that are formulated with certain ingredients, but they're touted for certain benefits, man, these should be tested in high quality models and hopefully by an independent source. I mean, we've already
Mhm.
discussed this in numerous episodes, right? We talked about certain products like Live Fresh, right? We talked about ingredients like the
Mhm.
nanohydroxyapatite, or even tests on publications that don't have a negative control or don't even utilize a positive control, especially
Right.
positive controls that have a dose response. I don't want to hear just about 1100. Don't tell me that 1100 and 5000 ppm fluoride have the same benefit in the paper because all your other
Nothing else is going to be
results is
valid.
going to be valid. Sorry. It's just, I know you used your best efforts, a lot of time, maybe money was spent, but that's not a good model. All right.
Right. And I know you bring this
And
up because nano is still
yeah,
it's a big topic and it's really not been proven.
yeah, it hasn't been proven, and I think it's gonna. And ultimately, if people can't understand it, and there's not something that they can specifically point to, it might fade, and to the point where it's not there anymore. Like it'll be there, but it won't be discussed.
It's like it was a fad.
Somebody will be like, "All right, well, we'll just put it in there," and it'll be kind of just like saying, "I don't know, I use natural ingredients in my toothpaste,"
Okay.
because it's gonna be too. It's too hard to validate it. I mean, I still get asked questions. What is the percent of nano HA that should be used? And I'm sure listeners are going to be like, oh, we know what it is. Really? You know, because you've experimented and you've looked at all these different formulations and you have solid data that have good negative control data, dose response fluoride, because you have to compare it to something. And you've done all of that. You have all of your ducks in a row and you're using models that are applicable to the clinical reality. You know,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of models. Just because you do a lab model and it might show a benefit, does that lab model actually have clinical implications? You know,
Right. That's
there's
a
a
great
reason,
point.
there's a reason why the FDA has testing models that are lab based. You don't have to do a clinical test if you're having a fluoride toothpaste. There's determined, agreed upon
Mm-hmm.
laboratory models that are known to correlate well with clinical outcomes. That is why if somebody uses the OTC monograph and they use fluoride, they don't have to do clinical studies.
Right.
And if you're going to do a clinical study to show that an ingredient has a benefit, you better be prepared to do multiple 2-year clinical studies because that's what's required, at least here in the US. And then
Wow.
you got to file your investigational new drug and everything else. But the point is, unless you have that data, and a lot of these researchers do not have that data,
No.
something is either lacking, right? They
Yeah.
don't know. I mean, well, you can tell me 1.5% is the magic level. Oh, 7.5. Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry, 10, maybe 5. And there's no way around this because the ones that are doing a lot of this talking about it are either the vendors of the companies, they're either the
Mm-hmm.
scientists that are at the top of the research group that have not ever formulated a
Right.
toothpaste and are not involved in the actual integration and looking at the
Yes.
enamel and doing these assessments. That is a problem. I'm not saying it has to be a one-stop shop, but where are the other checks and balances and where is that pattern, right? We need a fact
Absolutely.
pattern is what it's usually called, especially in accounting, whenever they're looking at, well, let's just follow the the
Mm-hmm.
outgoings and the incomings, okay?
Always to
There's all
follow
this,
the money.
follow the fact pattern, build your case. If we were detectives, we would use that by a syllogism, right?
Mm-hmm.
This. These are things that we know, and these are our deductions.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with here. Where's your fact pattern? Have you made multiple formulations? What model did you use to test these? And was that model appropriate, not only from a negative and positive control perspective, but what is its clinical relevance? And probably most importantly, can it be replicated? Can somebody completely independent outside of this research group or
Right.
research team, can they reproduce what you have? I'm not saying exact numbers. I'm
Right.
saying the relative difference. There's always going to be variability. We're
Mm-hmm.
using biological specimens if we're using enamel or dentin. Obviously, if we're using humanoids, right? There's also going to be some innate differences, but transparency is going to have to be
Yes.
key. Replication is going to have to be key.
Yes.
These are important things. Appropriate models, I mean, and it really comes down to that. It comes down to that. I hate to use the term, but it's almost like ethical development. Is this responsible? Are you having a performance
Yeah.
based product that was responsibly developed? Everybody's concerned about the environment, and rightly so. But what about the ethics?
Yeah.
Where is that? And usually in business, ethics is okay. I get it. We understand.
It's like
But just because it is doesn't mean that,
ethics.
but they can work hand in hand. And
They can,
honestly,
absolutely.
this is one of the reasons why some of the very large companies still are being successful. If for no other reason, they don't want to get sued, right? They
Right.
lose that market share. But what helps keeps them on, trying to do certain things is because, of these reasons.
So it's all of that is so true. I think this was an important episode because it's really important for all of us to understand that just because something is promoted or published
Yeah,
or
that's right.
written on you find it on the internet or whatever, it doesn't mean that it works or it's truthful. That's the hardest thing, I think, to explain to people, even young people growing up, that just because you see it on the internet doesn't make it true. So just because someone has a name published in a paper, no matter how big the
Yeah, it
researcher's
doesn't
name
matter
is,
how, what institute it was,
nope,
college, doesn't matter the researchers' names. I mean, there has to be other factors. And sometimes, this is one of those things. If you can't get some other researchers that have also had papers saying, hey, look,
that's
we
my
know
key
this worked.
takeaway.
I mean, we did an episode not too long ago, right, where we compared sodium fluorophosphate and sodium fluoride, and I talked about that. One of my mentors, George Stuckey, who was there at the beginning of the whole
Yes.
Crest fluoridation, toothpaste innovation with stannous fluoride, right? He and 5 other scientists who are all very widely known and recognized in preventive dentistry, including names like Weffel and Featherstone.
Yes.
They all assessed looked at the stats on the clinical data and said, look, sodium fluoride is superior to MFP, full stop. Here's why. You know, that is a show. That has not been done for
No,
nanohydroxyapatite. You don't see a consensus of
not
different,
even close.
authors. Sometimes you'll have like task force for like the American Dental Association. Sometimes they'll have special groups and they'll say, hey, look, this is what we have. But they'll assess the data and then they'll make their statements, right? I don't think that they have any promoting like acceptance of nanohydroxyapatite. And again, I know that that's a society, and sometimes the society disagrees with, with different groups. I'm not saying that's the only thing, but I'm saying let's look at some of these other researchers who have a pretty lengthy history
Yeah.
of publishing, models
The key
and have
figures in
success.
this field
Exactly.
can't even agree.
Have they even done? And you don't see that. You
No.
haven't seen that. You'll see scientists and authors who are public, and you know what? Those scientists might be great in their own right. We're not saying that they're not, but if it looks like it could smack of any kind of bias,
Or they're just trying to promote.
yes, and oftentimes I've seen these nano A reviews, they are loaded with bias, and that's just not my opinion. This is independent reviews that are publishing that saying, wow, the risk of bias here is huge.
Yeah.
It just needs to be addressed. Again, we're not only trying to pick on nano HA. There's going to be a ton of other things.
Yeah.
It could be whitening. It could be other non-fluoridated agents that are now coming on to market. It could be like bioglass types of things. Could be other things like, I don't know, some of these keratin-based things that we've talked about. It could be restorative materials. I mean, we're only touching a small poor point here, but we're doing that to show the example.
Right.
Just extend this to other aspects of dentistry. If you're listening for this, about dentistry or whatever. I mean, even still to this day, there's still talks being presented about sugary drinks and what it means for dental caries and dental erosion and, metabolic health and all this other stuff. I mean, these are the same discussions that have been going on for 60 years. Yeah, duh. But the point is, that's a consensus. Right. That's a consensus where you have people saying, hey, diet sugar, that is bad.
Yeah.
Where is that for nano? You don't see all these big, studies that are coming out saying, this is what we need and this is how we're doing it. That's the difference here. And these are just some of the things that we can look for and to say, hey, well, what's going on? And then you have to look for, well, who's pushing it? Who's promoting it? Is it the vendors, the suppliers of the NHA? Is it the contract manufacturers? Are there certain trade groups? Who's pushing the desire here?
Who benefits?
Who benefits? Anyway, so yeah, so there was a lot in this one. I really wanted to do this study, this episode actually, just because there was a lot of good stuff and it's very recent, some of it. Yeah. Especially with that economics, MIT, and AI. I was just like, you know what?
And that's just applied across the board.
Yeah, because AI is already being used to interpret data. I remember we were even in that conference in California, and the one talked about AI having trouble, detailing aspects of reading the X-rays, and it's not going to be perfect. It's still going to be subject to some kind of error and bias, right? So there's going to be these questions that will not go away. They just won't go away. But it's more of like, this is just a reminder, right? To say, hey, look, question some things, look at some things. You don't have to be an expert in the field, but if something
seems off,
even a little bit,
or too good to be true,
then, that's always the cliche and stuff. But if it just seems to be off, and for me, for nano, well, what level's the best? Right there, that's off. If you can't point to it,
right.
And then, or you have to qualify and say, well, it depends on, this and where you get it from. Right. Well, that's going to be a little bit much because there's too many questions on there, and that would require, that would actually command then, I would think, get your stuff tested. I want to see it in the right models, and then let's put this in the, clinical evaluations anyway.
Absolutely.
So I go on. But anyway, so this is a really interesting thing. Yeah, we're very happy that you are enjoying listening to us, and we appreciate you listening or watching to the show. Again, Dr. Rob, we're going to close now alongside Tami. Thank you for listening to Dental Formulators Playbook, and stay curious and keep smiling.